Hello, Soberinos, and welcome to this week's Friday Fix. Today, it's all about the importance of mental rehearsal. What is mental rehearsal? I'm going to be explaining exactly what it is, and more importantly, I'm going to be explaining why it's a strategy that you really need to be aware of. It's a technique that you really need to be using a lot. You need to be using it on a regular basis in order to set yourself up for success and in order to be able to stay on track and get into that confident, in control, easy, relaxed, enjoyable way of living your life sober. Now, mental rehearsal is a technique that lots of people all over the world use on a very regular basis. We all do it automatically, actually. We all do it unconsciously. Um, but people who are really successful in their field, whether they are successful athletes, whether they're successful business owners or entrepreneurs, whether they're successful educators, whether they're successful professors, whether they're successful coaches or therapists, they will be using mental rehearsal in a really conscious and purposeful way to set themselves up for success and to make sure they are performing at their best. So, what do we mean by mental rehearsal? Well, all mental rehearsal is when we start imagining a scenario playing out in advance of it actually happening in reality. That's all we mean by mental rehearsal. So if, for instance, I was going to, I don't know, I've got a thing coming up at the weekend, where I'm going to be helping Stuart, my other half. He sells electric bikes. And I'm going to be helping him by going to an event on Sunday morning where we are going to take out the electric bikes and we are going to have them on display. We're going to give out a few leaflets. We're going to chat to people and we are going to try and convince people that actually ditching the car and going on an electric bike is much better for them. It's better for their health and fitness, and it's better for the environment. And it's better for their finances because they're not spending so much on the car. So I'm going to be doing this on Sunday with Stuart. And when I start to imagine that event right now, I am mentally rehearsing it being quite a dull day. I'm imagining that it's going to be a bit of a drag because I'm going to be helping him first thing in the morning load up the van with bikes. We've then got to drive to the location. We've then got to unload the bikes. It's going to be quite cold, quite grey, possibly quite drizzly and rainy. Um, I've then got to put on a smiley face and be a really outgoing, sociable, and happy person and start engaging with passers-by and people walking past. Um, I've also got to put myself out of my comfort zone a little bit because they will be asking me technical questions about the bikes, which I won't be able to answer, and I'm going to have to hand them over to Stuart to answer the questions that I can't do. So when I imagine this situation unfolding on Sunday morning, I'm imagining it being a bit of a drag, a bit dull, a bit boring, a bit of an effort. And I'm imagining that I'm going to be a little bit bored. And I'm imagining it's going to be a bit of a pain in the butt because if I need the loo while I'm there, I'm going to have to find a cafe to go to. I'm not mentally rehearsing this situation being fun, enjoyable. I'm not looking forward to it. So, mental rehearsal just means you're imagining something happening in advance of it actually happening. And we do it all the time. I'm doing it right now when I think about this event coming up on Sunday. You do it all the time when you're imagining various events and scenarios that are coming up in the future. Now, the thing is about mental rehearsal is it happens unconsciously. We're not even aware we're doing it most of the time. It just happens. It's something that's going on in our heads. We're completely unaware of it. And most of the time, we are mentally rehearsing stuff going wrong, stuff being bad. We're mentally rehearsing um, we're mentally rehearsing things from the perspective of the harmful, unhelpful little voice in our heads that's telling us bad things about ourselves. We're mentally rehearsing things based on unhelpful belief systems that we might be unconsciously carrying about with us. And we may have formed these belief systems way back in childhood. So if we're carrying any kind of unhelpful beliefs about ourselves, it's likely that these unhelpful beliefs or these limiting beliefs are fueling the kind of mental rehearsal that we're doing. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this in a moment. So if we don't actually choose what we're mentally rehearsing and how we're mentally rehearsing stuff, the chances are that we are mentally rehearsing negative or limiting or unhelpful outcomes. And the most important thing to know about mental rehearsal is we create our own future realities through our mental rehearsal. So if I'm imagining having a really boring, dull, hard work, effortful kind of day on Sunday, it's much more likely that that's the reality I'm going to create. That's what I'm going to experience on Sunday because that's all I'm imagining. So we create the reality from what we mentally rehearse, from how we imagine it's going to be. And remember that we're doing this all unconsciously, so we're not often aware that we're doing this at all. So let me just move forward a slide. So how it actually works. So the best way to describe this is to give you an example. So let's say, for instance, someone is going to a job interview. And let's say, for example, that unconsciously, they're not even aware they're doing it. It's all happening within the sort of inner unconscious workings of their mind. They're actually mentally rehearsing things going wrong. So they might be mentally rehearsing going blank when they're asked a question. They might be mentally rehearsing arriving late because there was a traffic jam and they got stuck, or something went wrong with the car, or they couldn't find the place. They might even be mentally rehearsing something kind of ridiculous that never happening. So like tripping over when they walk through the door, or falling into the room, or something kind of embarrassing happening, like if they're a woman coming out of the interview and realizing one of the buttons on their blouses was undone in an unfortunate place, or if they're a man walking out of the interview and realizing that their fly's been undone. People can unconsciously mentally rehearse a whole array of things. Another one for a job interview might be rehearsing that somebody might rehearse that they're answering the questions wrong in some way, or that they might be revealing themselves to be a fraud and an imposter and not having any right to be at that interview. Or they might be mentally rehearsing that all the other candidates are better than they are. They might be rehearsing being in a blind panic and being super anxious and sweating everywhere when they're in the interview. They might be mentally rehearsing forgetting the interviewers' names. We have a natural tendency to rehearse the worst. So that's just one example. Now, if you can imagine someone preparing mentally for a job interview in that way, imagining and rehearsing all of those different things, it's much more likely that doing that kind of mental rehearsal is going to result in higher levels of anxiety. It's going to result in more panicky, nervous type behaviors. And it's much more likely to result in that person going blank, not being able to answer a question because they're so panicked, even though they know the answer. And if they were talking to their friends in a pub, they'd be able to rattle it off quite easily. Because they're in that interview situation and because they've been mentally rehearsing everything going wrong, it's much more likely that when it actually comes to being asked the question, that they are going to panic and go blank and fluff it and mess it up, and then just feel awful about themselves, and so create this snowball effect into just performing really, really badly on the day. And that's how mental rehearsal works. So let me give you an example of going to an event sober. So if I actually no, before I do that, I'm gonna read out a really good quote for you. There is a book called The Source, Source, by Dr. Tara Swart, Swart, Swart or Swart. Now, she's a renowned neuroscientist and she's done lots and lots of investigation and research into how the mind works, how the brain actually biologically and scientifically functions when we're doing mental rehearsal. And I'm just going to read you out a short passage from her book, which gives a really clear example of how this all works. Because that's the thing I wanted to say to you, actually. Bear with me while I just read this, because I think it's the way that I've written this in this document actually probably expresses it better than I will if I'm just kind of doing it off the top of my head. So unconsciously, these are my words at the moment, unconsciously, we tend to imagine the worst. So it takes some conscious effort and application to train our brains to imagine the best case scenario unfolding. Our brains struggle to tell the difference between a remembered event and an imagined event. In other words, they struggle to tell the difference between what's real and what's imaginary. When we imagine something like going wrong at a job interview, our brain kind of assumes it's true, it's real. When we imagine ourselves succeeding in something, not only are we providing an alternative to the negative mind talk and images we might be experiencing and that we often give ourselves, but we're also kind of tricking our brains into believing that the event we've imagined is kind of real. It's possible. The brain believes what we imagine to such a large extent that if we were to just imagine performing a physical task, like for instance, lifting some weights, the action of imagining ourselves performing that task will actually deliver similar physical responses in the body, in the muscles that we're imagining we're using, and in the brain as if we'd actually really performed that task. So what happens is in the scientific experiments they've done is that when people have been imagining themselves lifting certain weights with certain muscle groups, when they've looked at the imaging from putting all the sensors on the brain and looking at various screens and things as to what's going on within the brain, the same areas in the brain are lighting up as if the person had actually been lifting the weights, and the same advantages, it might not be exactly the same, but certainly there have been advantages in terms of building muscle to just imagining yourself doing that than there is in when you're actually doing it. I feel like I'm mumbling that a bit, but I think you get what I mean. So that when we imagine ourselves performing a physical activity, it's actually firing off the same muscle groups and the same brain cell function as it would if we were really performing that activity. And this is where I'm going to bring in Dr. Tara Swart's quote, because this is really useful. It's a few sentences long, but let me share it with you and see what you think. Studies show that people who imagine themselves flexing a muscle achieve actual physical strength gains and activate brain pathways in the cortex that are related to the movement. Similarly, when exercise psychologist Guan Yu, am I reading that correctly? I can't see without the glasses. Oh, yeah. Guan Yu asked a test group to do imaginary workouts at the Cleveland Clinic Foundation in Ohio. His team found increases in muscle mass despite not doing any activity. Incredible. 30 young, healthy volunteers participated in the study. The first group of 8 was trained to perform mental contractions of the little finger. So in other words, going back to my words now, in other words, the little finger, they just imagined that they were performing muscle contractions in their little finger. The second group of 8 performed mental contractions of the elbow. And the third group of 8 was not trained, but participated in all measurements and served as a control group. And finally, 6 volunteers performed physical finger training. So you had a couple of groups that were just mentally rehearsing the little finger movements and the elbow movements, and you had a group of 6 who were physically rehearsing and practicing those muscle movements, and you had a control group as well. The training lasted for 12 weeks, 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week. At the end of training, the first group so the first group being the ones that had mentally rehearsed moving their little finger, the first group had increased their finger strength by 35%. 35%. They hadn't done any physical activity. They had just imagined themselves building their muscle. They had increased their finger strength by 35%. The second group had improved their elbow strength, don't know what they did, by 13.5%. So that was less, but still significant increase, despite taking no actual physical activity. The control group showed no significant changes in strength for either finger or elbow tasks. Now, despite the fact that the group who actually did the physical exercises on their elbows and fingers saw greater benefit overall, the increase in the groups that were just imagining the movement is still mind-blowing. And back to my words again, other neuroscientific experiments have been done which demonstrate that when subjects imagine events, emotions, and actions happening, the same energetic activity lights up in their brains in exactly the same way as when they're actually experiencing those same events, emotions, and actions for real. Now, I'm going to stop reading out loud to you now because that's going to get boring if I carry on. Am I still recording? Sorry, I lost the plot then. I was looking at a different screen and I suddenly had this awful, awful sensation, this awful thought that I'd stopped recording there. So that's the kind of a little bit of a delve into the science of it, just to kind of convince you really that this is true, that this is very real, that there is this phenomena that we use our mental rehearsal in order to get the same effects as if we were really doing that thing successfully. So let's use an example of what someone might rehearse when they have to do an event sober. So let's say you have a wedding coming up. Let's say you have a weekend coming up. Let's say you're going out for a meal with friends, or you're just getting together with friends, or maybe you're having an evening with your partner who's drinking. Now, the kinds of things that you might rehearse, or certainly that I've rehearsed in the past mentally, with an event like that coming up is it's going to be awful. I would imagine myself, and I might even picture myself being bored. I might picture myself or tell myself that I'm going to be boring, because the thing about mental rehearsal and imagination is it can work in different ways. Some people have a stronger sense of a voice speaking to them and telling them how awful it's going to be, and other people will actually visually picture it, either as a sequence of still images or as a moving kind of video. Now, it doesn't matter which one of those you are, and some people might just actually get a vague sense of something. It might not be anything as clear cut as hearing a voice or seeing any clear pictures. It might just be a vague sense of something. None of these is right or wrong. Whatever your way of imagining things and mentally rehearsing things is, that works for you, and that's absolutely valid. So we all do it in different ways. The way I would do it is I would tend to have a voice talking to me in my head, telling me that I was going to be bored, that I was going to be boring, that I was going to have an awful time, that I was going to get really stressed, that I was really going to want a drink, that as soon as my partner or somebody else opened a bottle and started pouring, that was going to make me really, really want to drink. And because I couldn't drink, I was going to have a really bad time. I would be mentally rehearsing that I was going to feel anxious and uptight, that I was never going to be able to relax, that I wasn't going to be able to converse easily and effortlessly, and I wasn't going to be able to join in with any laughter and conversation and silliness. What else might I mentally rehearse if I was, and I used to rehearse in the days when this was an issue. I might mentally rehearse having to leave early and kind of counting the seconds, counting the minutes, until I could actually leave and get away from it. I might also mentally rehearse other people questioning why I'm not drinking, and me feeling awkward about that. Um, I might mentally rehearse people noticing that I'm not drinking and thinking I've got a problem, and that would exacerbate my feelings of paranoia, my feelings of self consciousness. And those feelings of paranoia and self consciousness, I could mentally rehearse those making me even more anxious and even more paranoid. So I would kind of mentally rehearse a vicious circle going on. And I would certainly be mentally rehearsing not enjoying it at all, um, and dreading it. So, as a result of all of that mental rehearsal, I would thus be dreading the upcoming event. So, that's kind of how it works. That's what we do. We create our own realities by mentally rehearsing what we don't want to happen. We tend to rehearse how awful things are going to be. Now, a really good example of how this works is my first gig sober. I did all of the above. I mentally rehearsed everything I've just described to you. Um, and because this was a significant event for me, this was a band I really, really wanted to see. And I loved going to see this band. And any other time I'd seen this band, I'd been drunk. My boyfriend had surprised me with tickets to this gig, so I really wanted to enjoy it. But I caught myself mentally rehearsing all the terrible stuff and how much of a chore it was going to be and how awful it was going to be. So I decided to take conscious control. And this is what we mean by positive mental rehearsal is you take conscious control and you decide to rehearse mentally the upcoming event in the way that you want it to happen, in the way that you want to experience it. So what I did was I mentally rehearsed going to this gig, and I mentally rehearsed doing it um, in a kind of positive, empowered, and confident way. So I imagined the sober, successful, and confident version of me going to the gig. And I imagined this person, this version of me, with my shoulders back, my chest out, my chin up. I imagined myself relaxing after the first half an hour to an hour. I imagined myself laughing and joking. I imagined myself with a tonic water or a lime and soda. I imagined myself joining in, singing along. I imagined myself laughing with the people around me. I imagine myself taking selfies in that kind of, the way that you get groups of people together enjoying themselves, and especially when they're drunk, kind of all doing a selfie together. I imagine myself doing that sober. I imagined myself driving home from the gig in the car with Stuart and chatting away to him and laughing about the antics of the evening, and sharing funny stories about what had happened. I imagined feeling the music going through my body. I imagined watching the band on the stage with a big smile on my face. I imagined myself bumping into people at the bar and chatting to them about how great the band were. I basically included just about every detail I could think of, what I'd be able to see, what I'd be able to hear, what I'd be able to feel, what I'd be able to taste and smell. I could even smell the stale alcohol around me, and the fresh alcohol around me at the bar. I went into such detail when I was imagining this, when I was mentally rehearsing this in a positive way, that I could actually feel the stickiness of the dance floor under my feet with all of the spilt alcohol. So I wasn't mentally rehearsing getting rid of alcohol out of the picture. Alcohol had to be in the picture. It had to be in the scenario because everybody around me was going to be drinking. They were going to be serving drinks at the bar. The reality was the floor was going to be sticky with spilt alcohol. The reality was I was going to come face to face with drunk people. So I needed to include all of that in my mental rehearsal, but I wanted to mentally rehearse a confident, happy, empowered, person that was really enjoying this evening, this gig sober, and coping with all of these kind of issues to do with alcohol all around her. So that's what I mentally rehearsed. And I even went to the point of mentally rehearsing how I was going to feel when I woke up the next morning, with a big smile, remembering back to the evening before and having a chuckle about the events. Having done that positive mental rehearsal, I went to the gig and it panned out almost exactly as I'd imagined it. So I came home having had the best time at this gig, and I had sung along. I'd sung along at the top of my little voice. Um, I had danced, I had laughed, I had even gone along with the crappy jokes that the guys around me were telling. I'd even ignored the blatant sexism that was going on around me and decided not to let it affect my evening. I'd even chatted to a couple of drunk women in the toilets, who were just raving about the band, and I found myself having a laugh and a joke with them, even though I was stone cold sober. I had the best time ever, but I know that I wouldn't have had as good a time as that if I hadn't gone to the effort of using the positive mental rehearsal technique to give my brain a chance to understand, that this reality was possible, that it could in fact create this new reality for me. And that's what positive mental rehearsal does. It gives your brain the chance to create the reality that you want. And that in turn gives you more of a chance of being successful in whatever it is you want to do. Whether it's having an evening with your partner sober, whether it's going to a gig sober, whether it's going to a wedding sober, whatever it might be, whether it's nothing to do with alcohol and it's just going to a job interview, or doing a driving test, whatever it might be, you can use positive mental rehearsal to set yourself up for success with anything, absolutely anything. I hope that has explained what I mean by positive mental rehearsal. If it hasn't, and there's a few gaps missing, or there are some details missing, do let me know. Or any questions you might have, post them in the comments below. There is, in the Go Get Sober guidance program on gogetsober.com, there is in module 1, step 2, a technique that I call Imagine the Difference. And this is a PDF document, or it might be a Word document, can't remember which, but it's a document that talks you through the strategy, exactly how to do the mental rehearsal that I'm talking about, because there is a sequence of steps. You can kind of do it based on what I've said today. You can just sit down and allow yourself to imagine all of those things, but it can help you even more to follow a series of steps that talk you through how to do it, and in what order to do it. So I do recommend that you go along to module 1, step 2, you look at the Imagine the Difference activity and you use that as your mental rehearsal strategy. And you use that time and time again for any tricky or challenging situations that you've got coming up. And that way you give yourself the best chance of success. You give yourself the best chance of staying on your sober tracks. And you give yourself the best chance of enjoying life while you're doing it. And experiencing life sober as enjoyable, fulfilling, liberating. There is something else actually in module 1. Module 1, step 3 has an activity called the Future Successful You. And that is another slightly different version of a positive mental rehearsal. So module 1, step 2 and 3 are the places to go, for learning how to implement a mental rehearsal strategy in more detail. So let me know if you have any questions. Post your questions in the comments below. I will look forward to catching up with you in tomorrow's Saturday share in the Facebook group. But in the meantime, let's go get sober together. Bye for now.